and helped organize an annual prayer breakfast in the Philippines from Marcos, which would send delegations of congressmen. And it's that kind of relationship of using this idea of common ground as a sort of, you build a wall around your common ground and say, okay, you want to be in, there's certain things you have to give up. We may not be talking about justice inside on the common ground. And that's where I think the family actually is really instrumental, because they don't use this really inflammatory rhetoric of the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons and the Jim Dobsons. They use this very soft spoken language. It's soft sell fundamentalism. In response to this book I'd written about this summer, two congressmen got together and wrote an op-ed, a guy named Frank Wolf, right-wing Republican from Northern Virginia, and Tony Hall, Democrat from Ohio. Tony Hall went to Congress, standard issue, labor Democrat from Ohio. Had a lot of affairs and felt bad about it, and the family came in and said, we can show you a better way. And the better way turned out to be becoming a big opponent of abortion, homosexuality, and championing National Day of Prayer. But it also meant he became a big advocate on world hunger. And he became, in fact, President Bush's first, or one of his very few appointees in his first term, Democrats, one of the very few new Democrats that he appointed. He made him ambassador for world hunger. He used that position to lobby hard for Monsanto. That was his solution to world hunger. So again and again and again, so much of this common ground ends up leading back to the same marketplace ideology. The common ground is the market, the idea that if we all get together in this free market where ideas can clash it out, and if we all agree to be polite and civil and believe in this model of reconciliation, then we can get along. And of course, there's a whole big narrative that gets excluded from that, and you know, that's, I think, the work of organizing that folks like Robbie Jones frankly have kind of fallen down on. The self-declared religious left, and the question is, where is the real left, and where are the religious folks who want to be a part of that left that frankly stands in opposition to power, not in collaboration with power?
The other, thank you. The other, one in terms of kind of responding to that question is, I think that religion, I see a few of my colleagues from Union, and in my best James Cone impersonation, religion always shows up late, right? That when we look at that, when we did systematic theology with Cone, he always began with the social movements first. Right? So feminism came along, then the church shows up, right? In part, as a pastor of a Congregationalist church, which is a unique group of black folks, is that we move in centuries, right? There's this kind of the rhythm of the church is a slow-moving rhythm. So that might be part of it. But also that we exist in a moment where there are not active social movements that can respond. And so FDR, who essentially is the creator of centrism, right? He's really a centrist. He's held up as this grand liberal, but he's really a centrist. But there's a socialist movement in place. There are communist movements in place inside the U.S. that are deeply organized. There's a strong labor movement that can bring pressure to bear on him, because the left under FDR ultimately wants guaranteed income. We get Social Security, which wasn't too bad, right? But we exist in a moment, comparatively, where Obama begins with the public option instead of universal health care. So, because if he begins with universal health care with a social movement behind him to bring pressure to bear, then we might get a public option, which is not exactly what we want, but it'll get us a little closer. I think also what has happened, so that is, I think that is one, that we just exist in a moment where we're just weak. I mean, the American left is fundamentally weak. I had a funny conversation in Istanbul recently with Cornel West and Tavis Smiley, and so I asked Cornel, I said, look, you know, what about social movements? And he was like, what social movements in the U.S.? Yeah. And so Tavis and I looked at each other and we just kind of laughed. It was like, he's actually right, but he didn't have to say it in front of white people internationally. And so we're just weak at this moment. We're just fundamentally weak. I think, so that's part of the second piece is that I think the seduction of postmodern politics that are preoccupied with epistemic skepticism, that no one fundamentally has an anchor in a system, right? And so what happens, I think, with the moves, and I'm not saying anything bad about feminist, Afrocentric, and other forms of critique that have a suspicion of meta-narrative and that kind of thing, but they're not anchored on the ground. Right? So who are you accountable to? Who do you respond to after we've borne the critique of heterosexist language within the framework of God talk? How does that play itself out in a congregation? Right? Thirdly, I think I see Frida Berrigan here, who is religious royalty as far as I'm concerned. And we lack a kind of tradition where there are religious leaders like the Berrigans who are willing to give everything. So there's not a premium placed on sacrifice within the framework of the church that says it's okay to risk everything. And so I think the combination of a lack of a social movement and the advent of epistemic skepticism combined with just the sheer cowardliness among most religious leaders puts us in a place whereby there's nobody to push back on the family.
Well, I mean, I disagree on one point. This is this question of whether there are social movements in America, and I know of a social movement that is it is broad, it is diverse, it is grounded, it has got all kinds of different ideas. It's got a lot of intellectual ferment. There's places where you go, people are staying up all night talking about this stuff. It's got room for intellectuals. It says you want to write, we're going to find some money for you to write. You want to go out and learn about things, and it has people who are ready to die. People who are ready to die for this movement, and it's called the religious right. There is a social movement in America, and to take it back to FDR, because I think that is really one of the sort of the turning points. It's where the family begins.